My name is Ted, and I'm going to be talking about what Merb can learn from Django. First off, a little bit about myself. I'm a web app developer here in San Diego. I know a lot of the SDRuby guys. Obviously, in our field, we're all opinionated about the technology we use. There's a nice little list of things I think are cool. Ultimately, my background actually is in Common Lisp, so I'm a little weird. That's why I love Python and Ruby, actually. They're both reminiscent of sort of that lost Atlantis. And I love Emacs, but that's neither here nor there. So yeah, and other things I do, I've run the local Django user group and the web standards group with Patrick and some of the other guys, Dominic. Anyway, so Merb and Django. When I was doing research for this talk, I ran into something I was confused about. I couldn't find out what the mascot is for Merb. I mean, merbivore, right, but what is that? I couldn't find any images. Google image search, merbivore, not a single animal to be found. I think this is a problem, and you guys should definitely look into this. For instance, the Django mascot is a magical pony. With
a snake inside of it.
Probably, yes, exactly. Yes. Someone said with a snake inside of it, yeah. So there is a lesson here, among these things that Merb can learn from Django. Don't let Brian Veloso unilaterally design your mascot, or you might end up with a giant flaming pink pony. Just safety tip. But before I go on, there's some terminology confusion. This stuff always happens. It's particularly weird here because Django's terminology is a little bit skewed from reality, I suppose. Anyway, so when you guys talk about a Merb app or a site, right? We talk about a project or a site, so we can just use site and it'll be the same. Where we get confused is a Merb slice is a lot like a Django app. So a Django app is basically a piece of functionality that you use to build a site, as opposed to the site itself. And then it gets really strange in the different interpretations of MVC. So in Django, a view is considered the piece of code that sort of assembles the data for the template, effectively. So it's closer to your controllers than, your views just are templates, right? So anyway, I will probably end up using these terms half the time like Merb does and half the time like Django does. So rampant confusion will ensue, and I apologize for that. So anyway, yeah. So Merb and Django are awesome. Seriously, fantastic projects. Tons in common actually. So the Merb team, did a lot of research, looking into different web frameworks out there, including Django, and drew a lot of inspiration, from a lot of different places. Both of these projects, they're modular, they're scalable, they're clean. When you have some familiarity with them, writing some code to do something is usually pretty obvious, how to do it. And both teams actually take the idea of 1.0 really seriously. Django just recently went 1.0, and it's been around for years, and you guys are working on your RC. The core here is, when you go 1.0, you're going to be serious about supporting that API, having a solid platform you're not going to yank out from under anybody. That's good stuff. So some things I thought I'd talk about, there's a list. I'll just get right into it. So slices. The core development philosophy in Django is sort of very app-centric. And again, that's a slice-centric, basically. And this is awesome, and you guys, I think, should just run with it. This is really the core of what makes Django apps very reusable. That's a link to a talk by a guy named James Bennett from DjangoCon a few weeks ago about how to develop reusable apps for Django. You just change Django to Merb, change app to slice, and you'll love this talk. I highly recommend it. So while in his talk he had this fourfold principles. Here are two of them. So what you want when you're developing a slice, you want it to do one thing and do one thing well, right? And you might end up with lots of them, and don't be afraid of that. So some of this should sound familiar. There are a lot of Macs in the room, but this is basically the Unix philosophy. You develop a tool, does one thing. It works well with other tools. You can pipe them together. You can compose them in nice ways. It's the same thing in the web world, and this is awesome. So, for example, in the MerbAuth talk yesterday, they were talking about how there's having separate slices for the actual authentication piece versus like the user management piece. And then there was a question from the audience about how you handle roles management in that. And that, I think, logically would be a separate slice as well. And what's nice here is you might have, so for instance, suppose you have a blog. Obviously, we've all developed blogs and our web framers of choices. And you have comments. You might want to do, say, OpenID authentication for a comment. You have that, name, email, URI field. But that's not really a user. You don't want to go whole hog and create users for everybody who ever comes by your blog and leaves a nasty comment. So that's a case where you might want to use the authentication slice without the user slice, et cetera. But then say you have an ordinary site and you have a sign-in procedure where once they sign up with their username, then you want them to fill out a profile, et cetera. You want these things to work well together and tie in together. So yeah, keep doing that. So where you end up is that your site or your Merb app is actually composed of all these little pieces and doesn't actually have much meat itself. You're really just sort of tying them together in a coherent way that makes sense for your particular project. And you're going to end up with lots of these slices. Hopefully, people are sharing them. Slices are gems. That's awesome. You could, toss these around, end up, with dozens of very commonly used slices. And that kind of gets intimidating. And doing this well is hard. Developing, slices that are actually, really reusable in that way is difficult. But a lot of very worthwhile things are difficult, and I'm all for it. So, one thing that came up the other day talking about slices is, if you run a slice, you namespace it well, and you're not going to have to worry about it clobbering some other part of your app. We sort of get that for free in Django because Python has namespacing like that, but that's neither here nor there. Anyways, the other 2 points from James Bennett were, in order to do this really well, you need to develop your slices in a very flexible way. His fourth point doesn't make any sense for you guys. You guys, slices are just our gems, right? And so they're already distributed in the same way you distribute any other Ruby library. You just gem install foo, and bam, you're good to go. That's totally awesome. The story in the Python world is a little more complicated. The joke is that we buy our eggs at the cheese shop. And that sounds weird. It should be. It's kind of strange, and we're still working on it. But anyway, so this idea of running flexible slices, when I say flexibility, I don't mean Monkeypatching. So Monkeypatching is great. It's this sort of giant hammer that we all wield on occasion, and it kind of feels really good too. But Monkeypatching is more of a last resort, right? It's somebody wrote some code, doesn't quite do what you want. You don't really have the time to send a proper patch. You just need it to get there, so you Monkeypatch a little bit. What we really want to be doing is providing, an explicit API that ties into your slice, so people can, change how it behaves in a controlled way that doesn't break it, especially next time you upgrade it. So basically, yeah, again, you want an explicit way of extending it and controlling it. And from the Lisp world, this is called protocol-oriented programming. So basically, this came up actually, it was a relevant point from the other day, talking about how in the Rails world there's a lot of method aliasing, and then upgrades happen, and then everything breaks, and then I go home and cry, and that's not fun, So, but having a nice API where your slice will be resilient when that API is used, that's really the way you want to go. There's this cool example for the programming language geeks in the room. The object system in Common Lisp has such a protocol, so you can change how inheritance works whenever you want, and it actually keeps working with the standard classes, and it's pretty sweet. It's actually awesome. But so some other examples from the MerbAuth talk yesterday. The way strategies, authentication strategies are pluggable is exactly what I'm talking about. That's really what a core win that you're going to get from that kind of API. Another example I brought up earlier, when you have user sign up and user profiles, you might have your business guy comes and says, I need them to agree to receive the newsletter, or more likely to say, no, I don't want to get your stupid newsletter. But that doesn't really fit in with user sign up necessarily, as a feature, right? So if you have a user sign up slice, you have a profile slice, you want to be able to tie those together in a reasonable way. But they shouldn't be in the same slice. So yeah, where you're going to end up with that is a sort of slice-centric development where that's just sort of the core way you build sites. And this is sort of how things are in the Django world, and I think it looks like you guys are moving in that direction, and I'm just sort of a cheerleader who's saying, keep going that way, because it's awesome. And you're going to end up somewhere really strange. So there's this Django project called Pinax, and it's sort of like a CMS, and it's sort of like a social network. But what it really is a collection of reusable Django applications, so Merb slices, that do everything except for whatever it is your site's supposed to do. So that sounds kind of funny, but here's an example. So my wife's a knitter, and so she uses this social network called Ravelry. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's actually kind of cool looking. Like I watched you're using it over the shoulder. I'm like, oh, I kind of want to use that, but I don't particularly want to learn how to knit. But anyway, so people are on there, knitters, and they put their projects on there and their yarn and all this stuff. And it has all the features that you expect to see in a social networking site. They can friend each other. They can favorite each other's, knitting projects. They can send each other messages, etc. But if you think about it, the guy who developed this thing, you want to be spending your time, or lady developing this thing, you want to be spending your time developing the domain-specific stuff, your representation for a knitting pattern or whatever. And all the side stuff, like, how to friend people on the site, all that stuff is separate to the core feature, and they're all, sort of orthogonal within each other. So if you have all those giant pile of slices, you might end up with something like Pinax, where you can just drop it in and then build your, one piece of novel functionality, and you're good to go. So one thing that came up yesterday was this project Cluttenberg, which is sort of a Merb-based CMS. And I don't know really anything about it besides I heard about it yesterday. But it sounded like it might be a step in that direction, and that's really exciting. Pinax right now, you can literally in a matter of hours put together a really solid site with tons of features for hikers or bike riders, or whatever you want to do. Anyway, enough about slices. They're awesome. Your router's awesome. I love it. It's way better than what we have, so I'm jealous. No, really, I don't know if you guys were in the routing talk yesterday, but I think most people were. That is actually sexy. I mean, it's really, really nice. And I'm very jealous. But here's an idea from Django that I think would be pretty challenging for Merb to adopt, but I would really love to see it. So in Django we have this automatic administrative interface where if you're using the Django model, you can shove it into this admin site register and then hook it up in your router. So it is kind of ugly. Yeah? And you get poof, instant CRUD editing of these things, and it looks really nice. I couldn't find a bigger screenshot or a better screenshot, but here's an example. This isn't like Rails scaffolding. This isn't code generation. It's not going to bite you when you change your model later. This is a core selling point of Django. Most Django applications don't bother building an admin interface. They just use this. So for instance, you probably know that Django came out of the journalistic world. So a lot of newspapers use it for their online papers. So there's a product called Ellington, which is a CMS built on Django that used by newspapers. The whole Ellington interface is just the Django admin interface with a little bit of styling changes and stuff. I mean, it's super amazing. The catch is it's really, really tied to the ORM. It introspects into your models to know what to do. And Merb is ORM agnostic. So that's a challenge. Now you might want to say, it's worth it. I think it's worth it. I know Matt brought this up as a wish for the future, and if you can do it, like you'll love it. So some other ideas. Generic views. So again, this is the terminology thing. These are really more like generic controllers. So the idea is, in this case, so you have a blog. Most blogs have like an index page, which lists the most recent, 10 posts or whatever, and also archive pages for a year, for a month, etc. And this is all the same. Like we've done this over and over again. There's no sense in writing that code again. So here's an example where we want to pass in. So this info dict is basically just knowing how to get at the domain objects for this sort of generic view. And then, again, ugly routing. We tied into, so you can see like object detail, archive year, archive index. Those are generic views where it'll look up the domain objects in the info dict and do the right thing for free. So that's awesome. And really, this is just sort of syntactic sugar. I mean, you can do all this by hand if you want, but why do it by hand 10 times over and over again? Another example of this sort of thing is Django syndication framework. So fig generation. That's basically it. So you have, again, we have this sort of blog model, right? You want to have a feed of your recent posts, a feed of recent comments. You effectively get it for free by dropping in like this. And then but you need to tie your models together with the syndication framework, and that looks like this. It's real simple. The meat of it is done by templates. So you need to provide, so for instance, in this case, a template for a blog post, how it looks in RSS or Atom. And then you're done. It's awesome. And here's another cool example. This is, again, Django comes from sort of the Python philosophy of batteries included. So a lot of what comes along in Django contrib is maybe even beyond merbivore in terms of kind of interesting stuff. So there's this thing called local flavors, which I love. So it's basically helpers for building locale-aware services. So this is an example of how to provide a form field with validation to read a U.S. Social Security number. I didn't realize that there was actually, they're pretty complicated. They're a lot like credit card numbers, I guess, in terms of, there are sort of kind of random ranges that aren't valid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this knows how to do that. You never have to do it again. And this has built-in stuff for tons of different countries, postal codes, phone numbers, et cetera. It's awesome. And it's pretty straightforward to write, actually. And then you just write it once, and everyone could use it. So if you've ever seen the Django documentation, it's beautiful and awesome. And I've heard really good things from MerbCamp here. I heard there are two different Merb books that are being worked on, and that's really exciting. And also, you guys, during the sprint, started in on the new wiki. I really encourage you guys to contribute to that wiki. So if you go to the Merb homepage and click on documentation, you land in RDoc. And obviously, references are great. But suppose you're a new user, you're unfamiliar with Merb, and you sort of want, the getting started and then, a little bit of a friendlier, reference work. That's currently lacking. Hopefully the books you guys are working on kind of fill that gap. But this is key, for bringing in new people. So yeah, to close, I wanted to talk about a little bit about, one of the core ideas of Merb is being agnostic to a lot of things. You can use the templating engine you want. You can use the ORM you want. The way Django is built is similar. I mean, you don't have to use the Django templates if you don't want. You don't have to use the Django ORM if you don't want. But there's a sort of a strong default. And there's a lot of benefits to that. So for instance, we get the admin interface for free because the assumption is you're using the Django models. And it sounds like Merb's sort of, kind of moving in that direction. Data Mapper isn't officially blessed. You can, obviously, a lot of people use Active Record, et cetera, but it sounds like, like for instance, in the Getting Started with Merb talk yesterday, like they had that opinionated list of pieces. And then, of course, jQuery talked yesterday about using them together. It sounds like you're sort of moving in the direction of, sort of a full stack that's blessed. And I think that there's a huge benefit to that. Yeah, so any questions?
So it seems like in the end you're just making it so that you could build a social networking site or an e-commerce system. Like you're going to have all the pieces to build anything. And I was just wondering, with the slice thing, I really like that. But it seems like you'd need a really standardized, centralized group of people modeling it all out, and they can pump it out within like a short period of time. And I was wondering, like, what's the best way to get that accomplished, like the quickest and the most
Sure. So in the case of Pinax in particular, there's a community built around that where they sort of made a list of Django apps that they wanted to see, that they thought would really make that a compelling project, and went out and found the ones that already existed and just adopted them, found ones that existed but really were sort of sorely lacking, and encouraged development or actively hacked on them, and then actually started working on the ones that were missing. So sort of this core group, this guy James Tauber over in Boston, kind of is driving that. You could do something similar to that. In general, I think it's that it's not just about social networking, right? It's about all sorts of other domains like e-commerce and whatnot. Pinax is driving it for social networking, but yeah, I'd say just find like-minded people, hack together, and the spice will flow. Any other questions? So I heard on IRC that that there's a dog that's actually the mascot. That's not on the website. You guys should get that up there.
How does Django
There we go. So Django has apps which are the same as slices.
Mm-hmm.
How are they essentially, and in Merb it's gems, and you can just do a gem update if you want to get the latest version and refreeze it. How does Django handle updates to the apps?
Sure. So the story's a little bit more heterogeneous in the Python world for honestly no good reason. I think everyone's opinionated about how that should work, and everyone has slightly different opinions, and so they haven't quite gotten there. But the common story is, so we have this thing called the cheese shop, which is actually PyPy now, because I thought the cheese shop sounded too campy. And we sort of have a packaging format called eggs, which are effectively gems. They're effectively zip of all the relevant stuff together. And we have a command line tool like gem called easy install. So you just say easy install foo, and it goes and gets it and all that stuff. Did that answer the question? Yeah.
You said that the Django world has better documentation, and you talked about kind of what we have, but what does the Django community have that we should have as far as documentation goes?
I think probably the best way to answer that is actually by example. So this is where you end up if you Google for Django. And you click on documentation. Besides the fact that it's really pretty and well designed and stuff, you're immediately, if you're a newcomer, you're drawn to sort of your sky high view of how it works. etc. But then there's a extensive tutorial, and then this is sort of the reference documentation, and this stuff is really, really nice. So you click through. It's effectively, so there's also the Django book, which is online at djangobook.org. But generally speaking, this is really accessible. There's a lot of attention paid to writing for people who don't already know what's on this page, right? And it just takes time, right? It doesn't appear overnight, but I really encourage you guys to contribute to the new wiki. This doesn't happen by itself, so
Is all that documentation still included when you download Django as well?
I think so.
Awesome.
I'm not sure offhand, but it's all, so in the Python world they often use restructured text. I prefer Markdown, but that's what it is. So oh well. And there's a tool that they use for this that generates HTML, etc. And all that ships with Django. Yeah. So. Cool. All right. Well, thanks for having me.